Hello YouTube! So a little while ago I made a video in which I criticised unintelligibility arguments. These are arguments that reject a position on the grounds that the position is meaningless or unintelligible. I'll link that video in the comments. Anyway, I recently came across an article by Charles Pigden on what he calls coercive theories of meaning, in which he presents a few other objections to unintelligibility arguments. So I figured I'd just talk a little bit about that in this video. Okay, so a coercive theory of meaning is a theory of meaning designed to dismiss some class of views as meaningless. It specifies a restricted fragment of language and then claims that only statements expressible in this fragment really make sense. So all significant truths can be couched in this fragment of language. The aim of a coercive theory of meaning is to show that one's opponents are talking nonsense. Their views are not even false. They don't even rise to the standard of being accessible for truth or falsity. The benefit of a coercive theory of meaning is that you can condemn your opponent as speaking gibberish, which is a particularly powerful criticism if you can get others on board with it. You don't need to learn their jargon, you don't need to argue about the specific details of their theory, you can just do away with the whole thing. Any argument for a theory that's meaningless has to be flawed, even if you don't identify any specific flaw in the argument. So, that's a coercive theory of meaning. Now, part of what distinguishes a coercive theory of meaning is the use to which the theory is put. So suppose that some philosopher holds a theory of meaning and uses it to argue that a large class of philosophical views are meaningless. Another philosopher endorses the same theory of meaning, but is only interested in accounting for meaning. She doesn't use this theory as a weapon against other philosophers. So she doesn't claim that the theory entails the meaninglessness of large parts of philosophy. In that case, the theory is coercive for the first philosopher, but not for the second. Now, Pigden argues that much philosophy of language has taken the form of coercive theories of meaning. Right? It's taken the form of theories that are explicitly designed to dismiss large parts of philosophy as meaningless. A classic example of a coercive theory of meaning is meaning empiricism. According to meaning empiricism, all ideas or concepts are derived from sense experience. So more precisely, the standard meaning empiricist makes two claims. First, that all words are defined in terms of ideas. Words are symbols that express particular ideas in the mind of a speaker and are designed to produce the same ideas in the mind of the listener. Second, all ideas are copies of sensory impressions. Now, it follows that if a word is meaningful, it must be possible to locate its source in sensory impressions. Meaning is grounded in sensory impressions. So the meaning empiricist specifies a fragment of language, namely that part of language that consists only of words that can be defined in terms of experience. Then the meaning empiricist assumes that any philosophical theory that is not expressible in this language is meaningless, unintelligible, nonsensical. So material objects, moral values, the self, causality, God, all of these have been argued to be meaningless on the basis of meaning empiricism. Take material objects, so objects that exist and have various properties mind independently. If meaning is reducible to sensory experience, then when we talk about objects, we're really talking about sequences of sensations. So a table, for instance, consists of a certain sequence of sensations of color and texture and so on. But if all we're talking about is a sequence of sensations, we're not talking about anything mind independent. And so, we have things like Berkeley's famous arguments against the intelligibility of matter. I'm not going to rehearse these sorts of arguments here. I have videos on some of these applications of empiricism, which I will again link in the comments. The crucial thing to see, though, is that most meaning empiricists do not propose meaning empiricism merely with an investigative spirit, right? Merely aiming to explore what meaning is. They often explicitly aim to condemn large parts of philosophy and other forms of inquiry as meaningless. Um, so, this is one classic example of a coercive theory. Coercive theories are also found in Wittgenstein and his adherents, in pragmatism, in ordinary language philosophy, in some of the appeals to formal logic, in ideal language philosophy, and so on. I won't go through the history of this. If you've engaged much with contemporary philosophy, doubtless you will have come across the claim that certain philosophical views are meaningless or unintelligible. So that's a coercive theory. That's what that's all about. So let's consider some of the objections to coercive theories of meaning. I'm taking some of these from Charles Pigden's article, also from Ian Dearden. He's also written on coercive theories and unintelligibility. So, first of all, Pigden objects that unintelligibility arguments often lead to a kind of pragmatic contradiction. Suppose that a supporter of a coercive theory enters into a debate with a philosopher who endorses a theory that the coercive theory entails is meaningless. So the coercive philosopher says, this theory, right, theory T, is meaningless. But in order to argue for this conclusion, that T is meaningless, it's likely that the coercive philosopher is going to have a lot of things to say about T. So she's going to draw consequences from T. She's going to say what would be the case under the supposition of T, for instance. She's going to know how to talk about T. Maybe she could teach T to others, right? Maybe if she has like students, she's able to stand there and explain T to them. If she speaks another language, she could probably translate T into that other language. She can paraphrase T in her own words. She can disambiguate T from related ideas. So she might say, when explaining T to an audience, she'll say, look, T says blah, 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 and that has to be distinguished from T star, which says blah, blah, blah. She's going to be able to draw analogies between T and other ideas. So she's going to be able to elaborate on T at length. And she'll be doing all of this in the course of constructing her criticisms of T. But now it looks like, it very much looks like T is meaningful after all. What else should we call this? Right? What else could it be that allows us to draw consequences from T, that allows us to disambiguate T from other theories, that allows us to draw analogies between T and other ideas? What could this be? If not that, this is this is meaning, right? Like if this isn't meaning, what is, right? So the claim is that the coercive meaning theorist is often going to end up in a pragmatic contradiction. In the course of arguing for the meaninglessness of her opponent's views, she ends up exhibiting the meaningfulness of those views. Now, of course, this could be avoided if the coercive theorist simply refuses to engage with her opponent. And this is actually probably a common attitude towards statements that we take to be meaningless. So if I hear some madman raving on the sidewalk, then I just ignore him, right? But this isn't really such an appealing move when it comes to philosophy, because in this case we're dealing with a situation where it's almost as if your peers have started taking the madman seriously, right? So let's say that a lot of people who you thought were intelligent and careful thinkers started saying, yeah, actually this madman has got some interesting things to say. Well, at that point, it looks like you might have to just, you can't just keep ignoring the madman, right? You have to start addressing what he's saying. And so this is kind of this is the situation that the coercive theorist is in, is that she's accusing her peers of gibberish, right? People that she probably respects and takes seriously and wants to engage with. But then in doing that, in the very course of doing that, in the very course of engaging with these ideas, the worry is that she's going to end up exhibiting the meaningfulness of them. So Ian Dearden, in his article, The Problem of Philosophical Nonsense, discusses a specific kind of pragmatic contradiction, which he calls the problem of diagnosis. So, as Dearden puts it, the problem is, and I quote, How is one to establish something of significance about an utterance without assigning meaning to it? So that's the problem. Now, this problem has been explicitly stated against verificationism. It's a very famous objection to verificationism. So verificationism says that a claim is meaningful only if it is either analytic or empirically verifiable. So this is a more recent form of meaning empiricism. Now, the problem here is, how are we to determine whether a given claim is analytic or empirically verifiable? I mean, we're going to have to think about the claim in question and then work out what follows from it. So we need to ask, well, first of all, is this, is the truth value of this claim determined by the meanings of the words, right? So that's with respect to analyticity. Okay, is it analytic, right? Is its truth value fixed by the meanings of the terms? If not, if the truth value of the claim is not determined that way, is there any set of observations that would confirm the claim? And if the answer to both of these questions is no, then by the verification criterion, the claim is going to be meaningless. But that's an odd conclusion, because if a claim is meaningless, I mean, presumably it couldn't be understood, and if we don't understand it, surely we wouldn't have any idea whether it meets these conditions. I mean, if a claim is meaningless, how could we say one way or the other anything about, what set of observations, if any, would confirm it? The problem is that the very act of working out whether or not a claim satisfies the verificationist criterion of meaning presupposes that we have assigned a meaning to the claim. So suppose, for instance, that I claim that some proposition such as God created the universe is neither analytic nor empirically verifiable. So I'm saying, look, this isn't true or false just in terms of like how we've defined terms like God and the universe, right? But nor is it the case that it's empirically verifiable. There's no possible set of observations that would confirm the claim that God exists. There's no possible set of observations that would confirm that God created the universe. How do I know that, right? How can I say that there's no possible set of observations that would confirm this statement? Well, it looks like I have to. The only way I can say that is by working out what does and does not follow from that statement. But if I can work out what does and does not follow from that statement, I must know what the statement means. I must have assigned a meaning to it. So this is, it's like in claiming that it's meaningless, right? I've exhibited its meaning, or at least part of its meaning. Now, this problem of diagnosis is a general problem. So take any theory of meaning, and this theory is going to include some criterion of meaningfulness, C, right? Then we have some utterance which is claimed to be meaningless. So the claim is that the utterance fails to meet criterion C. But now, how can we determine whether the utterance meets criterion C if the utterance is not meaningful? So let's say, for instance, that C is some sort of pragmatist criterion, where we're saying that, for an utterance to be meaningful, it must be connected to action in some way, right? Maybe, the truth or falsehood of the utterance must make a difference to our course of experience in some relevant respect. Maybe it must be possible to use the utterance in the prediction of some phenomenon, or apply it in building technology, or, use it in some way in our daily interactions with the world, or something like that, right? Well, surely if we can work out whether or not a given claim would make a difference in this respect, well, we've already assigned a meaning to the claim. Or suppose that C is some sort of ordinary language criterion. So in ordinary language philosophy, what will often happen is you examine a specific philosophical utterance and ask whether it has a non-philosophical use. Is there some situation outside of philosophy, say in ordinary life or in the sciences or whatever, where this utterance would be appropriate? If not, it's likely meaningless. Right? The goal of the ordinary language philosopher is to show how various traditional philosophical problems are in fact meaningless pseudo-problems, which arise due to this kind of misuse of language. But the problem is that in order to assess whether an utterance would be appropriate in certain circumstances outside of philosophy, well, again, surely we've already assigned a meaning to it. So this is the general problem, right? We take any criterion of meaning that you like. Suppose you have a statement that's accused of meaninglessness. Okay, so does the statement meet the criterion or doesn't it? In order to apply the criterion, it looks like we have to understand the statement. But then isn't that just what it is to assign a meaning to the statement? Okay then, quick advert. If you like my channel, you can support me on Patreon. So if you sign up to my Patreon, I do have bonus videos available there. Um, Also, if you just want to send a one-off donation, well, that would be appreciated as well. You can send me a donation on PayPal. Now, it occurs to me that this particular slide, I probably should have changed this before recording this video. So, private tutoring, I do kind of offer it, but um, it's difficult at the moment because I'm just extraordinarily busy with other things. And the Discord was deleted like yesterday or something, maybe the day before. I've lost track of time completely. But I recently got rid of the Discord. So, yeah, for now, I guess this is just the Patreon stuff is all that this is really for. Anyway, with that said, let's get back to meaning. So, another issue that Pigden raises is that coercive theories face a problem of inclusiveness. So the idea here is that coercive theories, when they're elaborated with precision, tend either to include as meaningful various statements that the coercive theorist intended to exclude as meaningless, or they exclude as meaningless statements that the coercive theorist intended to include as meaningful. Again, this problem was most famously observed with the verificationists. There were a number of different ways of formulating the verification criterion of meaning. All of these formulations had the problem that they would either be so broad that they would include as meaningful various metaphysical and religious propositions. So there tended to be, for a lot of these formulations, there would be sort of various kind of logical tricks that you could use to extend meaning in the verificationist sense to metaphysical claims and to religious claims and to pretty much any proposition, in fact. So they would end up just being way too broad, right? Or they would exclude as meaningless various propositions that the verificationists wanted to be okay with. So, they'd end up excluding various statements that are made within the empirical sciences, statements about scientific laws, for instance. Now, the point is that drawing this kind of clear boundary between science, which the verificationists liked, right? They wanted to say that's the meaningful stuff is science, and then these various other domains that they wanted to dismiss as meaningless. Drawing that boundary in terms of a theory of meaning turned out to be very difficult, much more difficult than initially assumed. Carl Hempel's article, Problems and Changes in the Empiricist Criterion of Meaning, is a classic discussion of this problem. Another example of this is the early Wittgenstein. So Wittgenstein outlined a theory of meaning in his book, The Tractatus, which had the unfortunate consequence that it judged itself, and basically the book as a whole, to be meaningless. So the theory of meaning proposed in the Tractatus ended up judging the Tractatus to be meaningless. Wittgenstein himself was quite happy to embrace this consequence. So as he puts it, my propositions serve as elucidations in the following way. Anyone who understands me eventually recognizes them as nonsensical when he has used them as steps to climb beyond them. He must, so to speak, throw away the ladder after he has climbed up it. But, knowing that the ladder is completely unintelligible, we might sort of ask, why should we climb it then? In fact, what we should be asking is not so much why should we climb it, but how on earth could we climb it? How could we climb it even if we wanted to? It's unintelligible, right? How could we use these things as steps? So, this is. But in any case, right, regardless of whether or not we are happy to embrace this kind of self-defeat, the point is You know, a lot of people might worry that, well, you know, there's something a bit strange about a theory of meaning that judges itself to be meaningless. So another example of this might be some sort of pragmatist criterion of meaning that connects meaning to action, to control of the world, to practical utility. You know, how exactly is utility to be understood? One worry here is that any statement whatsoever might end up counting as practically useful if we view a broad enough range of experiences as valuable. So armchair metaphysical speculation might bring pleasure to groups of people in various ways. You know, the construction of metaphysical theories might tickle the desire that we have for explanatory understanding. And then you might think, well, why isn't this pleasure in itself valuable enough to count as a practical benefit? And then, you know, why shouldn't that be enough to just, you know, extend meaning to all of these sorts of statements? So there's a risk of over inclusiveness here. This problem of inclusiveness can, of course, be avoided if we just refuse to provide a theory of meaning, if we refuse to provide a criterion of meaning. The later Wittgenstein of the philosophical investigations is perhaps the best example of this approach. Pigden has a very dim view of this kind of thing, so I'll just quote what he says here. In the philosophical investigations, he has nothing but a mixed bag of metaphors and a vague gesture towards use, plus a rough line round the privileged users. Without a developed account of what makes language meaningful and an account backed by argument, how does he know that what he uncovers is nonsense? And why should anyone believe him when he claims that it is? So, I mean, look, I guess the point is that from the point of view of anybody who's not already on board with Wittgenstein's armchair linguistic intuitions, Wittgenstein's condemnation of particular philosophical utterances as nonsense it's just going to come across as totally arbitrary and unmotivated. At least I guess that's how Pigden feels about that. So if we and you know, this is going to be a general worry about trying to avoid giving a detailed theory. Like if you start accusing other people of just saying things that are completely meaningless, right, then of course the question is like, well, all right, you know, what exactly is meaning, right? What is it for a statement to be meaningful? Like, give me a theory. What's the criterion that you're using to make that judgment? And if you can't give an answer to that, then it's going to kind of seem like, well, this is a little bit, this just seems a bit arbitrary and a bit unmotivated. So that's the worry there with that one. Okay, so another argument that Pigden gives is a kind of Moorean shift. So G.E. Moore gives a famous argument against skeptical positions. I will link a video that I've done on Moore in the comments. But Pigden basically adapts Moore's strategy against coercive theories. So first of all, notice that a coercive theory, when used against some philosophical idea, is going to have this sort of argumentative structure. It's going to say, you know, if criterion C is correct, we have no concept of X. Criterion C is correct, therefore we have no concept of X. So we might say something like, you know, if meaning empiricism is correct, we have no concept of matter. Meaning empiricism is correct, so we have no concept of matter. Or we might say, you know, following Hume, right? If meaning empiricism is correct, we have no concept of the self. Meaning empiricism is correct, so we have no concept of the self. But as the saying goes in philosophy, one person's modus ponens is another's modus tollens, and we can just kind of flip the argument here. So we can say, if criterion C is correct, we have no concept of X, but we do have a concept of X. So criterion C is not correct. So if meaning empiricism is correct, we have no concept of matter, but clearly we have a concept of matter. Obviously we have a concept of matter. You know, like there's loads of very intelligent people talking about matter in great detail. So clearly we have a concept of matter. So meaning empiricism is not correct. So, and I mean, this general argument obviously can be used against any coercive theory. If I think that X is meaningful, right? Like if I say, you know, I take myself to have a concept of matter or a concept of the self or something. The question is, why should I discard those intuitions in favor of my opponent's preferred theory of meaning, right? Why not simply take it that, okay, if the theory of meaning in question entails that there is no concept of matter or no concept of the self, well, that just indicates that the theory of meaning is incorrect. Um, so, I mean, I think that what's going on here is that when we look at certain ideas, ideas like matter or the self or any number of other ideas that have been the target of these sorts of unintelligibility arguments, I suspect that many philosophers are going to think, well, we're just more confident in the meaningfulness of these ideas. We're more confident that we're not just spouting gibberish when we talk about matter or the self. We're more confident in that than we are in any of these technical theories of meaning that have been proposed by other philosophers. I mean, especially given that many of these philosophers who are proposing these theories of meaning are engaging in what kind of looks like motivated reasoning. It looks like they're proposing that theory of meaning precisely because they object to the concepts in question rather than exploring in an investigative spirit, So yeah, I mean, when there's a conflict between the ideas in question and these theories of meaning, well, it's the theories of meaning that we should doubt. And note that this doesn't require the belief that any of these ideas are actually true. So, if you take the original Moorean shift, the Moorean arguments against skepticism, what Moore would have said is like, well, there is matter, and we know that I know that there is matter. But that's not what's being said here, right? We're not claiming that there is matter or that anybody knows that there is matter. We're saying something, I mean, presumably rather less controversial, right? Which is just, we just have an intelligible idea of matter. We just know what we just we have this concept. Like, that's it. We just have the concept of matter. That's not a particularly outlandish claim. Or so I suppose the argument would go. Now, of course, in itself, I mean, this sort of Moorean response can come across as mere foot stomping. And it's probably going to seem very weak if the coercive theorist can marshal arguments in favor of her theory of meaning. Because it's not as if we just have, it's not as if we just have, on the one hand, some concept like matter, and then on the other hand, a theory of meaning, right? We're also going to have arguments in favor of the theory of meaning, presumably, right? Presumably, philosophers are going to come up with arguments in favor of their theories. So in itself, I mean, yeah, this kind of Moorean thing, maybe it just sort of seems like, banging your fist on the table. But Pigden argues that the Moorean response gains further support when we consider the question of what it is that a theory of meaning is actually supposed to be doing. So what is a theory of meaning for, right? What questions is it supposed to answer? Well, Pigden says that the purpose of a theory of meaning is essentially to explain how we use symbols to convey ideas and information. I mean, that ultimately is that's what we're supposed to explain there. So, I produce these sounds and images, and in this way, I influence other people to, in certain ways. So maybe I get them to perform certain behaviors, or to react in particular ways, or to think about particular things. So if we're sitting at the table and I want some salt that's at the other end of the table, I can say words like, could you pass the salt? And this will prompt you to give the salt to me. I mean, depending on the reaction I want from you, I might say slightly different things or with a different tone of voice, right? Sometimes I say things which others feel they can understand and they can respond in a variety of ways. If they recognize it as a request, they might comply or refuse. Sometimes I say things that others find confusing. They feel they don't know what I'm saying. They don't quite know how to react. I mean, this sort of phenomenon, that's what a theory of meaning is all about. So Pigden says, what he says is, look, I quote, the facts which a theory of meaning is supposed to explain are our intuitions about what does and does not make sense. To tell us what it is about the meaningful strings that makes them meaningful, and what it is about the meaningless strings that makes them meaningless. And in this case, I take it that what Pigden is saying is that, look, we determine what the meaningful strings and the meaningless strings are. We determine which strings are meaningful and which strings are meaningless on the basis of our linguistic intuitions about what does and does not make sense, right? That's it. That's that's how you determine what counts as meaningful and what counts as meaningless. And then the theory of meaning is supposed to provide an explanation of that. Now, a coercive theory, in principle, cannot achieve this goal. This is because the whole point of a coercive theory is to privilege a specific part of language and exclude some other large part of it as meaningless. It aims to show that various utterances that were considered meaningful are in fact meaningless. And these are not just utterances where, a person might have misheard or failed to pay attention or something like that. These are utterances from careful, intelligent people who have spent a lot of time reflecting on the utterances in question. A coercive theory has to entail that a large segment of some population is mistaken about what is meaningful. Otherwise, it's just not going to be of much interest as a coercive theory. Like a coercive theory which entailed that the utterances of just some single lone guy on a street corner, right? If we're saying, well, those utterances are unintelligible, that's not really going to be of much philosophical interest. Okay, to be of interest to philosophers, the coercive theory has to condemn large portions of philosophy. But if it does this, Pigden says it's just not going to explain the phenomena that a theory of meaning is supposed to explain. So there's a tension between the coercive goal of the coercive theory and its goal as a theory of meaning. Because by excluding large parts of discourse, right? So philosophical discourse, if we're saying that large parts of philosophy are meaningless, well, you're just going to be rejecting the data that you're supposed to be explaining, right? You're just going to be saying, because what you're supposed to be explaining is precisely that, look, there are some strings that are meaningless, some strings that are meaningful, some strings that are meaningless. The meaningful strings just are these strings where, like, you have large sections of the population who take themselves to understand those strings. They take them to be to have sense, and they sort of react in significant ways to those strings, right? Like that is just what this theory is supposed to be accounting for. And that's why we should take the Moorean response seriously in this particular domain. So Pigden says, we don't discard the facts because they fail to fit the theory. We discard the theory because it fails to fit the facts. And in this case, our linguistic intuitions constitute the facts. So we can't discard. Like, that's why when it comes to, like, there's a conflict between our linguistic intuitions and what the theory of meaning says, that is why we should favor our linguistic intuitions, because the linguistic intuitions constitute the facts that the theory has to fit. So a final point from Ian Dearden in his article with the wonderful title, The Refusal of Philosophy to Do the Decent Thing and Die. Dearden suggests that one reason to worry about coercive theories of meaning is that there are no uncontroversial examples of nonsensical or meaningless statements, at least not of the kind that is attributed to philosophers by coercive theorists. There are, of course, uncontroversial examples of nonsense in a more general sense. There are statements that are just ungrammatical. Like if I say, made of is moon green, green, cheese human 300, right? I mean, okay, that's, that's just not grammatical. There are also nonsense words that have been given no definition. 'Twas brillig and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wabe, right? I mean, a lot of the words there are just made up on the spot. Now, accusations of nonsense in philosophy are made against grammatically correct sentences composed of independently defined words, and that are accepted by a large group of people to be intelligible. There are no uncontroversial examples of this. So what we're looking for then, right, like a case of nonsense in the relevant sense needs to be some sentence P that meets at least three conditions. So P needs to be grammatical. It needs to be clear that the person saying P takes herself to mean something by this statement. And it needs to be clear that she does not in fact mean anything. So that is, she doesn't mean anything, right? It's not enough to show that what she's saying is inconsistent or self-defeating or vague or anything like that. right? Because it might be that, maybe inconsistent, self-defeating, vague statements are perfectly meaningful. It has to be clear she doesn't mean anything. I mean, these are only necessary conditions for nonsense in the relevant sense, maybe not sufficient conditions. But anyway, the point is, there are no uncontroversial examples of this. Indeed, there are no uncontroversial examples of this even outside of philosophy. So when it comes to other sorts of errors that philosophers make, we can usually find uncontroversial examples of those errors outside of philosophy. For instance, there are uncontroversial examples of like affirming the consequent, right? The logical fallacy of affirming the consequent. We can just see examples of that. Or the base rate fallacy, right? We can find examples of that. Or begging the question. When one philosopher accuses another of begging the question, there may be plenty of debate about whether the philosopher in question has, in fact, begged the question. But both philosophers will probably at least agree on at least some examples of arguments that beg the question, right? There will be some uncontroversial cases where we can say, yeah, that's an example of what it is to beg the question. Now, that's not the case when it comes to nonsense, right? So, for instance, I mean, Dearden says, well, like, consider the kind of case of writing word salad, apparent word salad produced by somebody who's under the influence of certain types of drugs, right? A person might take a drug, write something that at the time they take to be meaningful, and then later they might look back on it and judge it as nonsensical. And maybe the rest of us look at it and are like, yeah, that's crazy, that's nonsensical. But then the thing is there are various alternative explanations of their changed judgment, including that maybe they just forgot what they meant. And perhaps if we took the drug and saw things from the same point of view as the person on the drug and put effort into understanding the statement, maybe we would be able to find meaning in it. I mean, so even in this kind of case, we don't have an uncontroversial case of nonsense that meets those three conditions. Now, there is perhaps a reason for this. So we start with some candidate nonsensical statement. It might be the ramblings of a madman, or it might be some abstruse philosophical position, but we have some candidate nonsensical statement. Initially, we find the statement baffling, but then we, describe the person who uttered the statement, we explain what it is that led her to utter it, and as we provide more detail about her worldview and her motivations, we might well begin to see the statement in a new light. So, as Dearden puts it, the real difficulty is in describing how she comes to say it, without at the same time describing what she means by it. I mean, obviously none of this shows that any given coercive theory is false, but I suppose the point is just to encourage skepticism of claims of unintelligibility. So, especially when there are large numbers of people who are intelligent and careful and so on, who all agree that the claim in question is meaningful. So those were a few other potential objections to unintelligibility arguments, and it's worth reading Pigden's article. I didn't cover everything Pigden talks about. He has an interesting moral argument derived from John Stuart Mill in there as well, but I didn't talk about that here. So I'm going to wrap that up there. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time, whenever I get around to it.